I'm not sure how many people are aware of the fact that British Columbia, what we call British Columbia today, was referred to by the Crown before it colonized this territory, was referred to as the Indian Territories. And it was over the gold rush, the first resource rush 150 years ago, that the Crown raced against the United States to actually colonize this place because they were afraid that the Americans would beat them to it. And it was always about resources, and it always has been ever since then. This is the central question to what kind of a culture and the communities we want to have in this province. These questions are with us today more than they ever have been. In South Dakota recently, the Pawnee and Sioux peoples, who are historically territorial rivals in some sense, depicted in the film Dances with Wolves, for those of you who've seen that, came together and signed a historic treaty recently to unite in solidarity over protecting their land from the Keystone XL pipeline, which our government is down lobbying for right now. And they invited members of the Yinka Dene Alliance to sign on to that declaration as well. And there are members, my friends in Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish, in the Coast Salish peoples in Vancouver, where I live, that are also fighting the Kinder Morgan pipeline. The three major expansion routes, the three major possibilities to grow this climate-destroying project called the tar sands, which according to the leading climate scientist in the world, arguably James Hansen, former head climatologist of NASA, there's 2 times as much carbon in the ground in the tar sands alone to drive what's required to drive our planet over the catastrophic tipping point of climate change. When you factor in the shale gas and the coal in northern BC and Alberta, we're probably talking another double that. And that's not just a Canadian thing, that's a global thing. The decisions that we're making here today will determine the future of the entire planet, of human civilization as we know it. We're in a pretty important place right now. You're in a very important place right now. But what's happening is that Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of this movement. They are coming together. The people opposing the Enbridge pipeline, people opposing the Kinder Morgan expansion to Vancouver, the Coast Salish peoples, and the Sioux and the Pawnee and other people in the United States that are in the pathway of the Keystone XL pipeline are realizing that we can no longer look at these things in individual silos. We have to think of this as the big picture here. The big picture is turning Western Canada into the next Saudi Arabia. That's it. The big idea of our federal and provincial government that was just reelected is to, at a very moment where we're being told by every expert that knows what they're talking about, that it's time to transition to a green economy, to find a sustainable path forward. At this very moment, we come out with the eureka idea that other people had 50, 60, 70 years ago, and we say, fossil fuels! That's our big idea. We are going to create, we have here the Western Sedimentary Basin that encompasses all this territory that I'm talking about. The oil, the coal, the gas. It's the second largest deposit of fossil fuels in the world, next to the Middle East. And we're sitting right on top of it. And they're on the decline. We're just tapping into this stuff. And new technologies like hydraulic fracturing have opened up supplies that were never available to us years ago. We're at a point now where America, Canada, we could be energy self-sufficient. No more oil from the Middle East. We're told this is a great thing because we have ethical oil here. It's an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. But this is a very real possibility because of these game changer technologies. But in doing so, we're basically choosing to destroy this planet's atmosphere. Period. You can do one or you can do the other. And I want to talk a little bit for a second about some of the other projects that are tied into this. I'm making a film right now called Fractured Land, which follows these issues in northeast British Columbia through the eyes of a young Aboriginal lawyer, soon-to-be lawyer, named Caleb Bain. He's an Echo Dene and Dunezah Cree man from Treaty 8 and Fort Nelson. And a little bit of background of, my family and my perspective of this colonial construct. It goes back a long way. My family settled, were some of the first settlers in the Peace Valley over 100 years ago. And I didn't learn this until I went up north on my first filming trip with Caleb, the subject of our film. I introduced myself to his grandfather. My grandfather passed away 10 years ago, but I introduced myself to his grandfather. I said, I think you might have known my grandfather, Jack Baker. He was a fur trader and trapper up here a long time ago, Fort Liard, Fort Nelson. He almost fell out of his chair. He said, that was my best friend 70 years ago. And Caleb and I were about the same age. He's a First Nations man. I'm a non-Indigenous person, a settler person in this province. But I think we're both realizing that we're dealing with the same issues. My family, we lost our ranch on the Peace River in 1968 for the first big dam, W.A.C. Bennett Dam, that really unleashed all this development, that created one of the most heavily industrialized places in the world. According to satellite and aerial photography images report studied by the David Suzuki Foundation recently, 67% of the Peace region has been industrialized. And that's, in some cases, layer upon layer. Logging, mining, conventional gas, unconventional gas. And it's just piled on top of each other. It's become one of the most built up places. And now they want to triple the shale gas development in order to feed the LNG plants that are proposed for this coast. And they want to build a new dam too. Another dam. They want to flood 80-kilometer stretch to over 20,000 acres of quality farm and forest land in order to create the power to power, and it would just be enough to power one LNG plant. The Shell plant alone, an 1,100 megawatt plant, Shell and 3 Asian partners, Chinese, Japanese, Korean. That plant alone would eat up the entire power coming from that one dam. We don't have an energy security problem in BC. We're self-sufficient in terms of our energy. These sacrifices that people like Caleb's family and mine made years ago, our land being flooded, has resulted in we have a pretty good hydroelectric system. It had consequences we didn't realize at the time. But what we do have is a real food security crisis. And I'm sure, you see it, people that fish and hunt, see it in the salmon, in the ulukin in Greece, you see it in the shellfish, but you also see it in terms of like our colonial agricultural system. We only grow 40% of our food in BC. 40% of our food, that's pretty poor. We have a 2-day strategic food reserve. That means if we stop getting trucks rolling across the border from Mexico and U.S. and stop the tankers coming in from China, importing our food, in 2 days, the supermarkets would be empty. And that's one of the poorest situations of any country in the world. And I'm not talking just the Western world. And so what are we doing? Flooding 20,000 acres of forest land that provides hunting for First Nations and settler people there, and some of the best farmland in British Columbia in order to create power to subsidize that. You will pay $10 billion as taxpayers to build that dam. And then you will pay even more through your hydro bills going through the roof just to subsidize the oil and gas industry. Are these the people in this day and age? Are these the companies that need the most subsidies? What about alternate energy? They're frozen out of the equation. What about, people, social programs? We're choosing at this moment to take the precious few resources we have. We're going to put this bill on the back of taxpayers and ratepayers, and we are going to subsidize a climate-destroying project for the benefit of multinational oil and gas companies. And I ask you, does that make sense to you as a taxpayer, as a citizen, as an Indigenous person? I've been very impressed by the way in which First Nations have territory to territory, neighbors, people at the coastal First Nations, the Karasekini Tribal Council, the Gitxsan peoples, all the way across to Alberta have communicated and listened to each other and built a consensus based on mutual respect. And I'm concerned, and it's not my place to tell anybody what to do in their territory, but I feel I have to say these things because nobody else is saying them. If decisions are made to bring through 4 gas pipelines, there's Enbridge, twin pipeline up here, but there are 4 natural gas pipelines proposed for the north here. And there's also Kinder Morgan. There's a handout circulating around. There's an image on here, a graphic. You can see the 8 or 9 different pipelines proposed for BC right now. There was an article, I'm going to get back to my point in a second. There was an article in the Vancouver Sun today, Pete McMartin. I'm glad to see this starting to get discussed. I just want to read you what he said because I read this on the plane coming up. The Sightline Institute out of Seattle, which is a think tank that does research on climate issues and environmental issues. According to them, there's 16 proposals for new fossil fuel ports on the coast of BC, Oregon, and Washington. Totaling, and these are new coal ports, these are gas, LNG ports, and oil ports, and condensate ports. And out of those 16, 11 of them are in BC. And these projects, if they were all built, would collectively, they would produce a total of 761 million tons of CO2 annually, which is 12 times the carbon footprint of BC today. That's the consequences we're talking about. You can change your light bulbs and get a Prius and do whatever you want. But these government policies, if they're allowed to go through, will increase our and our carbon footprint in BC has gone down. Our internal, we're doing a good job. Actually, we are working hard. In the last 10 years, we reduced our carbon emissions in BC by 6%. We've reduced our electrical consumption. We're actually working hard at conservation here, but all of that will be wiped away and wiped away by 12-fold if we allow this construction of what I call the carbon corridor, turning British Columbia into the new carbon corridor to bring fossil fuels, all manner of them, to new markets in Asia. And they're all interconnected. You know, the condensate and gas that come out of Northeast BC, Caleb's territory, Treaty 8, part of that goes to Alberta to extract and dilute the bitumen, and then the pipelines would go across BC, and some of the energy from the dam would go to power the fracking and the LNG, and it's all interconnected, and it's all part of, a decision of what kind of future and what kind of economy we want to have. And so I say this because the point I wanted to make is I would encourage any nation who's making decisions about pipeline right-of-ways through their territory or about new gas plants, LNG plants, to consider the impacts outside their territory. There are air impacts from burning the gas that's going to be required in order to power the compression. As I said, it takes an enormous amount of energy to cool that gas and turn it into liquid. Some of that will come from a new dam. Some of it, a lot of it, will come from burning gas in Kitimat and Prince Rupert. That has air pollution effects. That has climate change effects. But then you also have to think about, where's this gas going to come from? It's going to come from fracking in Northeast BC. And what is that doing to people in those territories? There's the Fort Nelson First Nation is fighting right now the attempted giveaway of 20 long-term water licenses, some of the biggest energy companies in the world. That would be good for up to 40 years. And we're talking about literally 1 trillion or more liters of fresh water that be pulled out of the lakes, rivers, and streams and the boreal muskeg in order to power this process. It requires enormous volumes of water to be injected with toxic chemicals and then blasted underground to crack open the earth and then withdraw the gases. And then those gases would be put in pipelines that would finally make their way to the coast, to Kitimat and Prince Rupert, to be turned into LNG. So I think the same level of dialogue needs to happen around all these issues that has happened around Enbridge. I think that's the model. I raise these issues not to, drive a wedge here into this beautiful solidarity that I see, but only to say that these are really important things to think about as we decide what kind of future we're shaping here. And these global impacts too. It's not just our neighbors, the territory over or the province over. It's what are we going to do to people in countries all around the world who are going to be subjected to global sea level rise and the other attenuating issues of climate change. I want to leave. I would just finish off with, again, I think no matter what political changes happen on the horizon, this is going to come down to us. We have to make it about that. And I'm not dissuaded at all. I see a beautiful, vibrant cultural movement here that's only growing in strength. And I hope that none of you are disheartened by what has happened in this, or too disheartened or demoralized by what's happened in BC in this recent election. We need to keep fighting more than ever right now, and we need to work together.